Good afternoon, Rotarians and guests. My name is Carol Bond, and I'm your MC for today. We would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians present with us here today. Welcome to our hybrid meeting to those online and in the room. Thanks today will be given by Peter Hollingworth, followed by the Loyal Toast presented by President Chris. Please remain standing and ensure that your glass is charged.
We hear a lot of words these days about fear, anger, depression, loss of self-confidence. They often come from how we view and think about the human situation and events that are occurring within us, and more importantly, in the world around us. Appearing to have no easy solution, the chief of these situations, of course, is to do either with natural disaster, war, pandemics, the loss of peace, the failure to find reconciliation between people. Yet we also know that people faced with situations of great danger and personal suffering have maintained their courage even in the face of death. Others are crushed when faced with similar circumstances from which they never properly recover, and they can't fulfill their potential. On a more personal level, if a person can be helped to view their own situation by thinking differently as to what it might mean, and bringing less emotional factors into play so that their situation is seen more objectively, to enable them to approach things then from a different perspective, which may lead to a more positive effect on the outcome. It's a matter of changing the game within your head. We now also know that some very deep feelings from the unconscious and semi-conscious traumatic events of the past, in particularly your childhood, require greater professional therapy within better and more accessible mental health systems, as we know. Taking all these things on board, let's just say, as we recall our own values and practices within Rotary, we give thanks for good fun, good food, fellowship, and the opportunity of service here and throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Rotarians and guests, a toast to Australia and Rotary International. Australia and Rotary International. Thank you. Please be seated. We will be breaking for lunch and we'll reconvene at 1:15. For those online, please take up the offer of the Zoom breakout rooms, which will open shortly. Thank you. It's wonderful to see you all here today, including those attending online. Today for our Cup Day lunch, we welcome Bernard Sundry, CEO of RSN Racing and Sport, 927 AM, speaking on the challenging landscape of thoroughbred horse racing. Bernard will be more fully introduced shortly by our Chair of the Day, Peter Hanlon. In the meantime, would you please join me in acknowledging and making them both welcome. We have visiting Rotarians, visitors and guests of members. I invite you and your host to stand when your name is announced and ask that you remain standing to enable the club to welcome you in a collective manner. So, guests of Rotarians, Irina Franken from the Rotary Club of Wellington, Irina Bayer from Canterbury as well, Will Abdo, a guest of myself, so if you want to stand as well, Millie Swan, and Anna Blaney, guest of Cheryl Lacey. Please join me in making them all welcome. Thank you. Please take a seat. To a few notices, we're very happy today to celebrate a birthday. Cheryl Lacey. Cheryl Lacey celebrates her birthday today and has become practice, along with celebrating a member's birthday when it falls on the day we meet, we also recognise their Rotary service. Cheryl was inducted in the club on 15 December 2004, nearly 20 years ago, with the classification publishing educational books. In 2013, Vice Presidents Peter Beasley and Peter Washington awarded Cheryl the Club Axel Award for significant contributions to the club as chair of the program committee and as a member of the Horizons Committee. Cheryl also has been a host to Inward Bound exchange student Emily Hinrichs, and twice served as Vice President for Presidents Keith McNeil and Peter Beasley. Cheryl is often rostered for an insightful reflection and is an active member of the Canterbury Waverley Fellowship Group. Thank you, Cheryl, for your continuing fellowship and service to the club and our community. Would you like to come up to the podium to receive our congratulations and many happy returns for your birthday? So, just do you want to inform everyone that...
Well, I'm 60 today, and a third of my life I've been a member of this club.
Right. So, can I... Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Cheryl. Happy birthday to you. Hooray, hooray, hooray. Okay, next item, Around the Bay silent auction. The Around the Bay team advises members that we are entering the last leg of the Ride for Disadvantaged Kids with our annual silent auction. Silent auction items will make excellent festive gifts. Please have a look for the link to browse and place your bids coming out soon. Upcoming events on the 15th of November, we have an expansion of our club's environment and sustainability consciousness away from food for an evening as we move into the transport, mobility and electric vehicles. Very pleased, of course, it's being held at the Porsche showroom in Brighton, and I have been nudged to speak to them to see if they can offer a Porsche for our silent auction. I don't know how small it'll be, but let's see how we go. So we have a guest panel from Visy, Energy Australia and Team Global Express, and they'll explore all the facts around electric vehicles. Tickets are selling fast. It'll be a fun night. Look forward to seeing you all there. Bookings, of course, via Humanitix, and a link is in our bulletin. Next week's meeting features Rotary Peace Fellow Lucienne Hayworth. Lucienne has worked around the Middle East conflict zones, and hers will be an interesting and informative perspective on the effects of refugee children and the need to continue their education. Please join us and invite a friend, sibling or child for an interesting lunch. And now to the important business of the day. Would our chair of the day, Peter Hanlon, come to the podium to take over the meeting and further introduce our guest speaker? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. With the iconic Melbourne Cup Carnival in good shape, and commencing the great four session days of racing on Saturday, it's appropriate that the topic today will have Bernard talking to the changing landscape of thoroughbred horse racing. And Bernard is eminently credentialed to talk to this and to provide a very entertaining and informative presentation on it. He's currently the CEO of Racing Victoria, CEO of RSN Racing and Sport 927, and previously he's held very CEO positions in Racing Victoria, with the Western Bulldogs, and New Zealand Thoroughbred Racing. So before he comes up, Bernard has a short video presentation to show to us, and he's asked me to everybody concentrate on the last couple of slides because there's there's items of interest in terms of betting in that one. So, okay. So over to you, Bernard, and I'll come to. There'll be questions afterwards because we're running ahead of schedule, so there'll be plenty of questions. Okay.
Thanks, Peter, for that very kind welcome. Thanks for having me. It's a great time of year in Melbourne, the Melbourne Spring Racing Carnival. I've been fortunate to be part of the racing landscape for a long period of time. And what I thought I'd do is a slide or a video, a 3-4 minute video that will show you a bit of what happened Caulfield Cup Day into the Cox Plate and setting the scene for the best racing in the world coming next week with the 4 days of Flemington. So thanks, Joe. So yeah, I've been involved, as I said, for 40 years in racing. It's a long time when I think back that quickly. I've had 5 years in New Zealand, finished up that contract in the middle of last year and thoroughly enjoyed New Zealand thoroughbred racing, and I'll talk a bit about that as we go through the presentation. But when Peter Dakin kindly rang me last week and said, would you come and talk about the changing landscape of racing? Well, any business is changing, but particularly after COVID, I mean, every business is adapting and finding new ways of working, and the racing industry is no different. Yes, it has challenges, and it's an industry that's stood the test of time over many hundreds of years. It employs in Victoria 121,000 people. The areas I'll touch on today, what's changing in wagering, betting. There you go. Thanks, Joe.
3 Group 1s on Caulfield Guineas Day. The Neds Might Power Group 1 weight for age, $1 million, 2,000 metre contest, the 138th edition of the race.
But it is all alligator blood, a 7th Group 1 coming up.
You know, these horses, they don't come along very often.
And Alligator just said, look, see you later, Alligator.
Horses are entering the mounting yard for our feature race today, the 143rd running of the Group 1 $3 million Neds Caulfield Guineas. Set to run, gates are back, and they're racing. Griff wanders about, it's still in front though, and Griff wins a dramatic finish.
I would have thought the margins, I definitely think the margin's too great, but...
Use definitive words in the protest room.
That's right, that's right.
Final race of Caulfield Guineas Day. We finish with a bang with the Group 1 Highland Race colours. Toorak handicap over 1,600 metres.
Decided a big finish in the Toorak. Antino and attrition, they hit the line. The photo and attrition kicks and wins.
This is what happens, Mitch. Congratulations, you're a Group 1 trainer. How good.
Young trainer for Warrnambool, he's your first Group 1.
Obviously, with Dad's passing, all he wanted to do was see me ride a Group 1 winner, so to come out and do it this spring, I know he was riding with me every step of the way today.
We look forward to everything we've come to know and love about the modern edition of the Caulfield Cup.
Without a fight, this wind blows, the hits in unison. Without a fight for the Caulfield Cup.
You would never send a horse to the races that you didn't feel was ready to go. This horse, we know him so well.
It's good when you know the results at the end, but you got to choose them before, unfortunately, but what a moment.
The Caulfield Cup Carnival comes to an end. Now we turn our attention to the Valley for the $2 million Manikato Stakes and the greatest 2 minutes in sport, Australasia's Weight for Age Championship, the WS Cox Plate.
Night racing at the Valley, and this is the night of nights. We start what is 24 hours of unmissable action here at Moonee Valley. Now, the change in the program tonight is Gold Cup night, 140 years of history and tradition, and we might see tonight a perfect lead-up towards the Melbourne Cup.
Can't get out, future history took the front. Here's Cleveland right down the outside. Cleveland over the top. Cleveland goes up, takes the lead and wins.
And the headline act in the Manikato, without a doubt, is the star Kiwi in Imperatrice, who comes here off back-to-back 1,000-metre track records at the Valley. She's got the Group 1 in her sight.
But Imperatrice called upon, still 3 lengths in front, and the Tangerine Tsunami's going to do it again.
This is by far my favourite race day of the year. There is just something about the Cox Plate, there's something about the Valley, the atmosphere. It's just an incredible race day.
Romantic Warrior, Mr. Brightside, still Alligator Blood. Mr. Brightside coming at it with Romantic Warrior. It's a photo finish.
We won the Cox Plate, baby!
A new Weight for Age champion has added his name to the Cox Plate on a roll. We now turn our attention to one of the greatest weeks of sport, the Melbourne Cup Carnival at headquarters, where crowds will fill Flemington to the brim, where champions of the turf will be crowned once again.
And she's extreme for Anthony Cummings. The Cummings name lives on in the Oaks. Still Zaki holding on. Zaki back to back.
A field of 22 set to tackle the 2 mile test worth $8 million.
Gold Trip is going to win the Lexus Melbourne Cup. Gold Trip wins it in a real staying contest for the ages.
Who's heading out to the carnival? Many takers? 1, 2, 3. Well, I've got some tips at the end, so I'll just look. No responsibility when I hand them out. So, thank you. Racing's been in my blood all my life, and I love it. I've loved it in New Zealand. I love it here, and sport also, having worked at the Western Bulldogs Football Club. What I'd touch on today is a few of the, I'd say the impacts of what I see as a changing landscape of racing across the betting, across Victorian racing itself, the rules, the regulations, the customer, what's the customer doing, what's the media landscape telling us, what are the clubs telling us, and a bit of a snapshot on world racing, and then New Zealand racing. I'll spread some of my experiences that I thoroughly enjoyed for 5 years working out of Wellington and working up and down the country with the participants and the clubs. And then there's some tips for the next 4 days of the carnival. But just to give you a snapshot of, my thing's not working, I don't think. Joe, I'll let you do it. That's it. So just to give you a bit of a size and scope study, the majority of revenue that Racing Victoria collects is from betting, from all around Australia for betting on Victorian racing. So we have a $60 billion wagering turnover, which is big for Australia, and of that, 8.8 billion in wagering turnover is generated on Victorian racing. There's about 150 individual bookmakers, including Tabcorp, that generate that money, but it's basically that $60 billion in wagering turnover comes from the top 10 operators. There are emerging trends in terms of what's happening with that wagering turnover. The industry got a terrific spike through COVID because people were sitting at home with their phones and their iPads and their laptops betting on racing. And we were very lucky through that period, not only in New Zealand but here, for the government to allow us to continue to race, both in New Zealand and Australia. And the industry has benefited from that in being able to put more prize money into the industry, being able to build better infrastructure. The time now is how do you continue to build on that? But there are emerging trends. We're seeing people betting in racing but then turning to sport. We're seeing retail, the retail stores you've seen most of your life in high streets and in the city, in suburbs, moving to digital, and also parimutuel fixed odds. So the world's changing rapidly for the industry, and the industry and the bookmakers need to adjust to ensure there's an adequate flow of revenue to the industry. At the moment, the way bookmakers pay the industry is through a percentage of turnover. It's average of somewhere between 3 and 4% of what gets paid by those 150 bookmakers to Racing Victoria from the betting on Victorian racing, thoroughbred racing by those operators. And we're about 15% of that $60 billion. We are well recognised throughout the country, and I'll share some of the statistics with you shortly, but they're the types of trends that are occurring in the business today. Racing to sport, retail to online, and parimutuel fixed odds are all impacting revenue streams for the industry, whether that's Racing Victoria, and Racing Victoria's role there is to set the racing program, set prize money levels, set strategies around infrastructure across the 66 clubs in Victoria, and then it's the club's responsibility to sell membership, be the customer-facing entities for the racing industry in Victoria. I've got to say, Victorian racing's in pretty good shape. I know you'll hear things about, welfare issues, you'll hear issues about the whip, you'll hear issues about competition between New South Wales and Victoria, but Victorian racing's in really good shape. It generates more than $4.7 billion in economic benefit to the Victorian economy and employs 121,000 people. It has prize money, which is the envy of every jurisdiction in the world of 312 million, and it continues to innovate with races like the All-Star Mile, breeding programs, spring racing carnival expansion, and finding just improved ways of. There's 9,000 horses that start in Victoria on an annual basis. It's Racing Victoria's job to make sure that the participants and the racing horses maximise their benefit, maximise their health, but also generate the appropriate wagering turnover to drive economic benefit for the clubs and the participants across Victoria. There has been a changing landscape in terms of rules and regulations, and this is no different to any other business. Health and safety is increasing compliance, increasing costs on trainers and businesses. Horse welfare, real focus on that for the industry to make sure horses before racing, during racing and after racing are looked after. The statistics say we are, but we have the next generation of people saying, is it right to race a thoroughbred on a track for gain? And that's something that is being worked on diligently by the clubs, by the authorities right across Australia. It's not just a question that's been asked as a challenge to the Victorian racing industry. It's something that's happening worldwide in Singapore, Macau, Hong Kong, and where do we sit in the relevance for the next generation of people coming that need to be our customers going forward. Racing Australia, you may have read, if you don't know much about racing, there's been a strong competition between New South Wales and Victoria at a federal level, and also at a level that we need to come together. We're healthy competitors between New South Wales and Victoria, but New South Wales want to get on and run their business for the benefit of their participants and their owners, as does Victoria. So would I say they're aligned at the moment? No. And I'm a great believer in any business you run. If you can get 80% right, the next 20% will take care of itself. So I know the executives at Racing Victoria and Racing New South Wales are trying to find ways to get better alignment. And I've got to say, the racing I've seen around the world, without government support and the relationships with government, you can't run a racing industry. And there's no better example of that through COVID. Without the support of the government, the industry probably would have been on its knees. Not being able to pay participants, not being able to pay prize money to filter back to trainers. So, Martin Bakula and the government did a terrific job to keep racing going in a very difficult time against, often widespread criticism about why are we still running racing. But they put protocols in place. As I was doing in New Zealand, when I was running New Zealand racing, the government was very supportive while we're in COVID, but the participants often didn't understand that they couldn't go to the races, that they had to be separated, that we had to put horses in other floats. There were borders set up between Auckland and the rest of New Zealand. You couldn't cross between the North and South Island. So the logistical issues during that time was very difficult. But the support of government is critical. Being able to pick up the phone and ring the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand for help, as here when the Chief Executive from Racing Victoria can pick up the phone and talk to the Deputy Prime Minister Deputy Premier about what's going on in the business. It's really important. And having a Minister of Racing in the cabinet has been vitally important for this country and for racing for a long period of time. So what's happening in terms of our customers? The demographics are saying everyone, age 55 and plus, we've got more people engaging. Age 34 to 54, we're holding the number of people in that age group that are engaged in racing. And that 18 to 34, we're seeing a small downturn in some of those, the younger demographic engaging in racing. So that's racing's challenge. How do we attract that next generation of people to enjoy the horse, enjoy a day out at the racing? And I've got to say, having been the last couple of weeks to Caulfield Cup, the Guineas and Cox Plate, I've never seen as many young people on a racetrack for a long period of time. So maybe we're starting to turn. And I know that's happening in New Zealand, where New Zealand have spent a lot of money on a marketing program to bring young people back to the races. And then when you look at that, and I talked a bit before about the wagering, the size of the wagering pool in Australia, and an $8.8 billion wagering turnover number out of Victorian racing. Well, the betting on Victorian racing comes from Victorians at 43%, 27% from New South Wales, 16% from Queensland and other states, 14%. So you can see with the various mechanisms we have in distribution of of racing, it becomes very popular in other parts of Australia, which Victoria's held that mantle for probably 20 or 30 years. The media, there's been lots of change in the media. 7 years ago, there was a decision to break what I call the old traditional model of watching racing, and that is go to your pub and club, watch it on Sky 1 and Sky 2, and if you were able to run some racing on free-to-air television like Channel 7, 9 or 10 a couple of times a year, well, that was always going to be okay, but we weren't growing the business. So what we did, at the time I was the CEO, we said to Tabcorp, right, we're not going to sign with Tabcorp first to be wholly and solely shown on Sky 1 and Sky 2. We wanted a free-to-air package in our media rights deal. So Channel 7, we signed a deal to set up a free-to-air coverage of Victorian racing on racing.com. And that sits as a digital channel. It's available to 95% of the population, and it's known as racing.com on Channel 78. You'll see, as a result of that, there are other things happening. Sydney Racing has better coverage on free-to-air. Brisbane Racing has better coverage on free-to-air. Adelaide Racing has better access to free-to-air. And now our streaming services are getting better and better. You'll see that we have over 600,000 users of streaming services for the next 4 days at Flemington. We'll see Sky Channel continue to play its role in the 5,000 outlets across the states, in pubs and clubs throughout Australia. Radio, the business I'm in charge of, we've got traditional radio still very much a service for the industry in Victoria, but now with the various streaming services we can have, streaming podcasts are very important. And we've only just unearthed all this content. There's 3.8 million podcasts downloaded in the last 12 months. We haven't been selling that to our advertisers or to our people. And that's become very popular. It's been popular for a while, but racing's just catching up. So as you can see, the mediums and the platforms that racing's now using, it's generating the benefit, and it's driving participation, it's driving talkability, it's driving that $8.8 billion in wagering turnover. The clubs do a fantastic job, and the metropolitan clubs each have their own entities, each of their own committees, and each of them right at the moment are in major structural change. You'll see the Melbourne Racing Club, there's a $300 million redevelopment of Caulfield that's underway. That's why they capped their crowd this year at the Caulfield Cup to 20,000. There's big holes everywhere at Caulfield, but a new grandstand, new horse facility, and customer facilities. They realise, the three metropolitan clubs realise, they need to meet the demands of the next generation, and each of the clubs are undertaking major redevelopments for the long-term future of the sport. The VRC, they'll have 250,000 racegoers over the next week at Flemington. It'll generate $422 million in economic benefit back to Victoria. It'll have 16,000 staff. It'll generate it has a potential of a global market of 750 million. It'll be the race itself, the first Tuesday in November. We broadcast into 209 countries, and it's also undergoing quite a big development at the top of the straight, where there's 2 towers of apartments and residential living going up, and that'll be another revenue stream for the club going forward. They've just built a new grandstand, 140 million. They'll admit they've had 2 years of struggle with COVID, where they couldn't use the grandstand, they couldn't repay their debt. The numbers I had before I left to go to New Zealand, it costs about $50 million to put the show on for 4 days, and they generate about $70 to $75 million in revenue for next week's, which is the best racing carnival in the world. But they rely heavily on Melbourne Cup. They rely heavily on the 250,000 or 300,000 people to come to the racecourse, enjoy the experience, to pay down their debt. So they're working through that. There's light at the end of the tunnel, and the 3 metropolitan clubs do an amazing job. Then you go to Moonee Valley, and they've been working on a redevelopment plan for the last 10 years. It's a $2 billion program. They're effectively, over the next 15 years, changing everything. It sits on 98 acres, 6 kilometres from town. The new residential developments, the first stage of that's completed. The next stage is currently underway. There's a massive hole on the left-hand side of the grandstand. And then the next phase will be in 2025. There'll be 2 more Cox Plates run next year in 24, then in 25, and then the course will be shut for 18 months. They'll completely rip down the grandstand, the track. The track will be realigned, and if anyone knows the valley, instead of it being where the grandstand is now, the finishing post will be down your left-hand side, down Wilson Street, and there'll be a new grandstand similar to this picture in the background that they'll build, and they'll also have an infield where the horses will circulate. There'll be activations until, so you can see the metropolitan clubs have got major developments happening. For the next 10 years. The challenge is how do you continue to race at these venues and attract customers? But they're all heading in the right direction with the right, with the right emphasis in mind, and that's multi-purpose facilities, engaging the new generation, and providing safe environments for the horse and their participants with track infrastructure. Country racing. Yeah, there's 66 country race clubs throughout Victoria, and just recently it was announced the merge of Pakenham and Cranbourne, and we have probably 4,500 horses down in the east. There's a stable around there. Pakenham 10 years ago purchased that property for $11 million, 600 acres. They built a new grandstand, a complete new facility from a dairy farm to a racecourse. They've still got land at the top of that area in Pakenham, or it's now Narnagoon, where they're situated, and they're heading in the right direction. The future is the merging of clubs, merging of resources, shared services is the way of the future, and it's terrific to see that announcement in the last 10 days. Country racing is playing a big role in running some of the Saturday metropolitan meetings at Bendigo, Ballarat, Pakenham, and the recently announced Geelong meeting to capture the what they call the holiday crowd down on the Surf Coast. On the 6th of January, they'll have a Saturday standalone meeting. There'll be no meeting in the metropolitan area. So you can see there's change at every level, which is really important. As far as world racing is concerned, Australia belongs to what we know as the Asian Racing Federation. You can see up on the screens there the members of that federation, and basically what the ARF do is they advocate on behalf of the Asian region into the racing jurisdictions like the US and the UK. And those groups come together 2 or 3 times a year, mainly on Zoom or Teams, but then once a year they get together in Paris where they talk global rules, global wagering, welfare. All the issues the clubs are talking about are relevant not only in Australia or New Zealand, they're relevant worldwide in all racing jurisdictions. But the one thing that keeps coming back through all these forums is racing in Australia is the envy of US and UK racing and Europe racing. So we're very lucky to have the structure, the participation, the government support that we have. Life is that not every state gets along with each other, but the reality is it's a healthy competition. They all strive to do better than their neighbour, and that creates a brand for Australian racing in other parts of the world that countries are envious of. I spent 5 years in New Zealand from 2017 to 2022, and their industry is worth $1.6 billion economic benefit to the New Zealand economy and employs 52,000 people directly and indirectly. In the first 6 months of the role there, John Massara did an independent report. John is a major breeder of Arrowfield, the owner of Arrowfield Stud in New South Wales. He came up with 17 recommendations. We drove a lot of those recommendations in the background to restructure New Zealand racing, and they're all now been implemented, every recommendation, and that was from new international revenue, where New Zealand racing wasn't benefiting from Australian wagering operators betting on New Zealand product, but nothing going from that bet back to the New Zealand industry. So that's a very important new revenue stream. It's probably worth about between $10 and $15 million a year back to the New Zealand industry. That's the 3 codes. The New Zealand government provided tax relief, reduced the wagering tax back to the industry. There's been good investment in racetrack facilities. There's been a revised venue plan where there were 49 racetracks in New Zealand. And when you looked at the economics of trying to run racing at 49 venues, it wasn't there. Health and safety, there were grandstands that hadn't been touched for 50 years. So this planning also took into account the closure of venues, not the closure of clubs. So the key message we sold into, which, you know, when you're trying to shut a track, it's not easy. It's people's livelihood. We said it's clubs that we want to, you know, it's clubs in New Zealand 150 years old. We want to make sure they raced at a venue a half an hour away. And that was really tough for 6 or 8 months doing that in COVID. But what it did do is we've now got people saying out of New Zealand, it was the right thing to do. In clubs these days, right across Australia, it's left to half a dozen, 1 or 2 people to run the day. It's all driven by voluntary labour. And if you haven't got that voluntary labour, particularly in the smaller venues around New Zealand, things don't get done. You know, tracks don't get maintained properly. Therefore, stewards won't allow racing on those venues. So there's an ecosystem in New Zealand that had to change. And fortunately, it's changed. It's changed for the better. They've now also got the new international wagering operator, Entain, engaged. The TAB had a monopoly in New Zealand. That's now changed. And Entain are over there now pumping good money into not only into the racing, into marketing initiatives, and the 17 recommendations that John Massara put in place are all now been implemented. So you'll see a bit of an upkick. They're a great breeding nation. New Zealand's known better for its breeding than its racing, but you'll see that there'll be initiatives between Victoria and New Zealand over the next 12 or 18 months. It's jumps racing. It's the All-Star Mile. Do we take more participants and more horses out of Moonee Valley when they race the All-Star Mile? Participants and horses that may have won big races over in New Zealand. So there's a collaboration and opportunity there, and very much there's about a $2.5 billion wagering market in New Zealand. $1 billion of that is on Australian racing. So they heavily rely on betting out of Australia, and without it, you know, if we didn't have when I was in New Zealand, if we didn't have Australian racing going, we would have suffered dramatically. So now. That's quick. Was that too quick? Is that right? We on time? On time. That's good. Righto. So what I thought we'd do, and I've got no responsibility in this, I'll just give you a couple of tips, leave you with a few what I think can win over the next week. There's a Purlier. There's a Purlier that raced at Cox Plate Day last week, and David Hayes came back from Hong Kong especially for it, and it won. So it's en route to the Derby, the 2,500 metre Derby, which I think can win the Cup. I think Gold Trip can do it again. And there's a Japanese horse known as Breakup, and it's cherry ripe. It's been down at the quarantine centre in Werribee and been trialling really well. Then on the last day of the carnival, the VRC have also developed, the Oaks on the Thursday, its favourite Tropical Squall, and people are telling me it won't get beaten. Famous last words. And then on the final day of the carnival, the VRC have done a terrific job in creating Champions Day. So there's a Champions Mile race over a mile, Champions Sprint over 1,200 metres, and the Champions Stakes over 2,000 metres. And these horses are all in really good form. Mr Brightside got beaten in the Cox Plate last Saturday. Imperatriz is a Kiwi, smashed his rivals last week on Cox Plate Day. There's won 3 Group 1s in the last 3 or 4 months. And Prowess, a beautiful horse out of New Zealand. So you might find the Kiwis and Mr Brightside's New Zealand bred. So doesn't say much for Australian breeding, does it? But Australian breeding's still strong, and New Zealand's going through a bit of a bright light at the moment in terms of supplying horses to this market. That's me. That's a brief snapshot of economic impacts, what's happening in New Zealand, what's happening with the clubs, what's happening in the media, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability.
Bruce Davidson, I got the first question. I could ask you 20 questions, but it's a fantastic presentation. You really gave it to us, I think, and we've got great faith in the racing industry after hearing your talk. The best race meeting I ever went to was Royal Ascot. Yeah. So when you can get the King to attend, I'll come along and enjoy the race.
He was there this year. He was there this year. Yeah, amazing. Oh, I was lucky enough to be there.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. When he comes to Flemington.
Oh yeah, they're trying for next year. I think. I think Sydney are trying to they've named a race after him for $5 million. So they're trying to get him there first before he comes to Melbourne. That's the competition that exists.
Two things. I wondered if you could talk about the rule about whipping. I've read an article, I half read it. I didn't really take too much notice, but somebody was going to complain if this horse was whipped too much or not whipped enough or something. If you could talk about that. The other thing, and it's slipping my mind right now, it was terribly important at the time. The other thing that really gets me about racing now is advertising for betting. I think it's immoral. I think it's out of control.
I agree with you.
And everybody's suckered in by the money. And something has to be done about it.
So you're absolutely right. So I'll answer that question first. There is a federal government review of online gambling at the moment. There's 33 recommendations to actually slow down the opportunity for wagering operators to bet as freely as they can on free-to-air television, in papers, and it will happen. It has to happen. I don't support the proliferation of wagering advertising. It's wrong. I think it's got to be confined to its market, to its racing channels, because it is hurting people, right? And I think it's hurting racing. It's definitely hurting racing. It's one of those things like horse welfare, the whip. The number of ads that are coming through on a daily basis, something like $350 million spent on advertising of all the top 10 wagering operators to capture share. I think what will happen, there'll be regulation by the government, has to be. Because in 2017, when they did the last review, the regulations they put in place haven't worked. So they're more serious about it now, and it will happen. It'll actually reduce that 150 wagering operators Australia-wide. There'll be a correction or a restructure of that, because all of them are dealing with the same. They're dealing with the same customers. All the customers are doing is going to each site and trying to get the best deal. So I agree with you. It's hurting the industry, and it needs to be reset, restructured, and it needs to be done quickly. On the whip, so in Australia, you're permitted five strikes before the 100 and unlimited between the 100 and the winning post. In New Zealand, it's 5 times before the 100 and non-consecutive strikes between the 100 and the winning post. We introduced that New Zealand rule to slow down the whip usage in the last 100 metres. There's one argument that says jockeys say we've got to carry the whip for safety purposes. Other end is let's eliminate it, right? So it's a hot debate at the moment. It'll change. It has to change. I personally think carrying the whip for safety and 5 or 6 strikes to straighten a horse up is probably where it'll land over the next 12 or 18 months. But it can't continue its current form. The problem we've got Racing Australia, who's an entity that manages as much as possible the national rules of racing. Each state has its own rules. It adopts the Australian rules, but it also has its local rules. And that debate around the future use of the whip is stuck in a dispute between 2 or 3 states. So I even know when I sat down with the New Zealand jockeys, half of them didn't want to use the whip. The other half said you can't do what you're doing. So we try to find some middle ground as a step forward. The next step will be in New Zealand, there'll be half a dozen strikes, or use it to look after yourself when you're riding a 500 kilo animal.
Yep. We have a question from online. The question preamble is: last year, bettors on Victorian sport lost more than $2.5 billion in sport and race betting. And as you've already mentioned, the social and health impact of gambling causes harm to many. And here's the question: could racing operate as a sport without gambling?
Well, it would exist without gambling, but it would be a cottage industry, right? It'd be an amateur sport like it probably was 50 years ago. It could exist, but I think it needs the money to sustain the 122,000 jobs in Victoria needs wagering revenue. 80 to 90%, I think I said 80%, there's some media revenue, but the AFL rely heavily on media revenue, but they also rely heavily on betting revenue. I think it's got to be regulated. I don't think we can continue to give the wagering operators opportunity to spend like they do on the platforms they do. That's the regulation that needs to happen quickly. There needs to be proper anti-gambling or problem gambling regulations and programs put in place. So yeah, I think the model is okay. It's a regulation that's wrapped around it.
Okay, thank you. I noticed from your slides you say that in New Zealand, one of the recommendations accepted was tax reform in New Zealand in respect to racing operations. What was that reform doing?
We basically reduced the wagering tax by 50%.
The wagering tax?
Yeah, wagering tax.
How is the
tax that normally
industry
went to the government.
How is the industry taxed in Australia, where I thought the position might have been that racing operations are exempt from tax, but betting agencies are fully taxable, perhaps as they should be?
Yeah, so the wagering operators pay their tax, they pay GST, they pay point of consumption, they pay product fees, then they pay tax on their profits. Yeah, so they're complaining they're paying the 4 taxes, but that's what it is. And the numbers are about, I've got this right, the average return is about 10 or 11% once, and less the taxes, less what's paid the industry, and the operators are left with 2 or 3% wagering turnover. Yeah, racing clubs are, the purpose is for animal racing and they're exempt from paying tax, that's right.
Can I just say a few words? Thanks, Bernard. Well, thanks, Bernard. That was absolutely unbelievably informative and entertaining presentation. And on behalf of the members and guests today, opportunity to express our appreciation in Rotary style. So thank you very much. We also we always make a token gift to our presenters. It's described as a token gift, so I've read it verbatim. Okay, and I've got it here with me. It's commemorative Rotary socks, which are elegant on the ankle, and also a commemorative coin. So thanks very much. Really enjoy. Okay. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thanks. I'd just like to say on behalf of you all here today, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it. Love sharing experiences and what's happening in the industry. And those socks will be great because this morning I pulled out 2 pair of socks with holes in them and my wife threw them straight in the bin. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much. There's quite a few remarks just to make before we close the meeting and stand up for the anthem. First of all, express my thanks and I guess the club's thanks to Carol Bond for all the work that she's passed through with her roles, and Peter Hollingworth for the reflections that he passed on to us today. If you can, and Joe, of course, as ever, for working the technology. If you can stay back for a few minutes to assist with the pack-up, that would be appreciated. Next week, as Chris outlined, there's a very topical guest speaker, given the conflict in the Middle East, Rotary Foundation Peace Fellow Lucienne Hayworth. That's a topic of absolutely current interest. Lucienne has a focus on education in conflict zones and worked in the region for some time. So please join us to be at the lunch next week. So.